welcome to Art with Ian. Today we're going to be talking about using Symmetry mode in Photoshop to get our design ideas down. So let's go ahead and get in there and start painting.
Okay, so starting out here, I'm just using the hard round pressure opacity brush. I've got the Symmetry mode turned on, set to vertical, and running the length of my entire canvas. And I'm just searching here. I know that I want to create a robot, and that's about it. I mean, you're thinking about human anatomy. I want the robot to function like a human, bipedal locomotion. So with that in mind, basically just designing and being really free about it. And the beautiful thing with Symmetry mode turned on, I'm only painting one side, and there's no pressure for any of the ideas I come up with to be matched. I don't have to, if I come up with a complex design idea or shape or something, I don't have to repaint that idea, and it's just outrageously freeing. It's so freeing. It feels great to know that whatever I decide to do, I don't have to go and do it again. Obviously, there's a responsibility in this as well, that if you leave Symmetry mode turned on for your entire painting, it's going to look horrible, because it'll look like you painted a painting with Symmetry mode turned on the whole time. There won't be anything unique about the opposing sides of the subject. So, and that's just not how things are in reality. But for getting the design down, it's just an incredibly freeing tool. And in this case, I'm just going to carry on and refine my design with a head-on view like this. But even if you knew that you were going to ultimately be doing like a 3/4 view of a character, you could still design them this way, and then use your design as a reference for your 3/4 view painting that you want to do. So, incredibly powerful design tool. Here I'm thinking about the shoulders, and I know you can't really tell by looking at it now, but I'm trying to think of everything I design in three-dimensional space, so that when I come through to do my lighting pass, my shadow and light and stuff, I can see what I was thinking. I can see where I left opportunities for the shape and form to be sold. I don't want the thing to feel two-dimensional. And really, one of the main struggles two-dimensional artists have, at least who do illustrations like the sort that I like to do, is making the viewer believe that they're seeing into three-dimensional space on a 2D plane. And the only way to do that is to understand how light works, and to understand that shape and form will catch light in a certain way. So a plane facing light will catch a bunch of light. A plane facing away from light will be fully in shadow, and then all of the intricate in-betweens, maybe something's turned slightly towards the light, which will be a slightly lighter value than something turned completely away from it. But when you're designing, if you're already thinking about shape and form at the very beginning of your design, you're a step ahead. If you only think about shape or the design, and you're not thinking about the full form of those shapes and how they're actually behaving within the three-dimensional space you're creating, then you're going to have a lot of problems to solve later the problems are always going to be there to solve, but if you're already thinking about them from the beginning, it really puts you in the right headspace, because you design with that in mind. So I'm still just using that same brush, hard round pressure opacity. The reason I'm using that brush for this phase of the painting is because you get a ton of like nuanced little moments where, like, let's say one stroke and another stroke cross over each other, and they create a slightly more opaque section in that moment where they cross over each other. And there's a lot of detail design that can come from that you wouldn't have thought about doing yourself, and you can go in and capitalize on just brush strokes, that you were doing one thing and you created another thing kind of without even trying. And as I go in and start to work on refining this guy, some of that will be more noticeable. Now I'm getting in there with a deeper, I've kind of sold a little bit of that shape and form I was talking about with the light, just in the chest plate and the shoulders. You can see how the shoulder turns, and then there's another kind of section jutting out from the front center area. Also, you can tell that his arms are turned inward based on that, and also seeing the plate over the top of the forearm area. You can tell that his arms aren't turned back, his arms are turned forward towards us. Also, you'll notice that right now, because Symmetry mode is on, it looks like I have two light sources coming from both sides of his body. I will eventually go in and set up my lights properly, but now I have the shape of, determined, so I just have to go in there and paint over the light with dark, and it'll turn one side into shadow. My lighting, I think I want to do over the top right shoulder, over my top right shoulder, and a second light right behind the robot to help really push the silhouette. Right now I'm using a lasso tool to go in and cut little details out of the bigger shapes to help make that silhouette interesting. Knowing that I want to backlight it means that it needs to be a little bit interesting. Or what's the point of putting a backlight on it and helping push the silhouette? Yeah, the lasso and the hard round eraser are the two tools I use for getting in there and cutting away from my main silhouette. So starting with a dark background and then using the gradient tool and a lighter gray to bring that light source like I mentioned a moment ago. So now it feels like the light is dispersing as it gets towards the edges of the canvas. That's great for not only making it feel like there is a light behind him, but to keep the viewer's eye in the piece. As it gets darker going towards the edges, there's less reason to look there. It's less interesting, so by default the viewer will keep their eyes on the subject. And composition is all about making sure the viewer sees what you want them to see. So I'm just giving him a little bit of like some kind of light. Mostly it's just there because I wanted the eyes to be red. I love the look of like red and gray together, but I didn't want him to just have red eyes and then no other hint, nothing else to play off that red. So hence the little light thing on his forehead, and I'll probably put one on his chest plate, like a little logo of some kind, and maybe on his hands I'll put little lights on the backs of his hands too. I've even left the spots for it. So now I'm grabbing like a kind of a blue, like a very gray but slightly cool blue color. And I have the layer mode, I've created a new layer, and I have the layer mode set to overlay. And I'm using my stipple splatter brush in my Essentials brush pack to create a texture. I did one darker one, and now I'm doing a lighter one, and then using the eraser to feather back the texture. And I just want it, metal is, you might not think of metal as being textured, but it is. And I just want that little bit of interest. I don't want just overly smooth. Yeah, it's not enough that when you look at it you'd think there's a texture on it, but it's enough that when you look at it you don't see just super smooth paint. There's a little something going on. And a lot of times when you look around the world, I mean, the world is textured. Nothing you look at has no texture. But a lot of times you don't notice the texture. It just is there doing what it does and making it look like the thing that it is. And if you take that texture out, that thing would no longer look like what it looks like. So texture isn't always, you don't always use texture for the sake of the viewer noticing the texture. So a lot of times you use texture for the sake of it and looking like something real without actually being a loud enough noise to get in the way of, you know, what the person thinks they're looking at, if that makes any sense. There we go, adding the lights to the hands, and like I said, put a little logo here. I didn't take much time to think about what that logo would be. I just wanted it to be something that worked with my shape language, which is mostly sharp and a little bit round. So that was basically the whole that was all I thought about when I made the logo. It's just something sharp and a little bit round. Shape language is an extremely important thing to be thinking about when you're designing. Something that feels like it was designed by someone else should have a notable shape language. So like this robot was clearly not just a pile of scrap metal thrown together. It is someone's creation. An engineer made this thing, and so by default it needs to speak to the designer of it caring about how it looked. And shape language is definitely a great way to get there. So I've used the marquee tool here. I created another layer, and I've got a selection that I put a stroke on, and that creates a perfect follows the selection perfectly. And I'm getting in there and I'm making like some kind of bolt like thing, bolt or screw or something like that. And what it's doing is, not only does it help it make this feel like it was built, it also, that small amount of tight detail here and there in a few places, makes all of the jumble of really loose, not definitive detail that's all around it feel by nature like it's more detailed and makes more sense. Just little tiny touches of high detail will really trick the viewer into thinking that everything is high detail, because once they notice that, they just assume everything is detailed. It's obviously there's a level. It's not going to solve if you have literally no detail, or if you've gotten so sloppy that things look like scribbles, then putting a couple bolts here and there is not going to save your design. But if you are pretty loose and then you have some really tight areas, it will help tighten up those looser areas, is basically what I'm saying. And here I am going through with a dark, like a really dark brown gray, and starting to refine the designs. And like I said about using the hard round pressure opacity brush in the beginning, I've been able to follow just, you know, happy accidents of intersecting lines where the opacity got deeper in an area where two strokes met or crossed over each other, and just kind of follow some of that stuff and turn it into like it was actually something I thought about from the beginning, when in reality I was just scribbling around with a brush that did all the work for me, mostly. So here I'm starting to refine the head. I'm using a hard round brush to erase, and what I'm doing is I push down in one area, I hold down the shift button, and then I push down in an area where I want to draw a straight line between the 2 points. And if you do enough short points, you can actually follow round shapes by doing that, and it's a nice way to clean things up without actually having to go grab a selection tool or anything like that. Alright, so going in with a shadow pass here. I've already done one, but now I'm going to start refining the shadow more. I don't want the viewer to try too hard to look at details in places where I didn't actually put a ton of them. And one of the best ways to stop a viewer from wanting to look somewhere is to just take away any reason to look there. So going super deep with the shadows, it's a great way to in reality, deep shadows, you don't see detail in deep shadows, so it's not only is it maintaining a sense of realism, it's also accomplishing a goal where I don't want to sit and paint high detail throughout the entirety of this guy. I want a few areas that sell it, that are in light, and then a lot of areas that just get pushed deep enough into shadow to not require a ton of time sitting there rendering. And I wanted to try and keep this piece as quick as possible without, forfeiting any level of care. But I didn't want this YouTube video to be an eternity as well, so I gave myself like a 2-hour time limit to get the painting done in, and then I sped it up a little bit and tried to keep the video in under half an hour, which I think I came pretty close. So that kind of made some decisions for me as far as how much detail I was able to get into. I forced myself not to get in and start noodling details, which is an easy trap to fall into. So starting to work on these blades, his weapons, and initially I went with what you normally would think of like an energy blade. I wanted this kind of like a sci-fi thing, right? So normally you think of an energy blade as being bright, but then I remembered watching Mandalorian and the dark energy blade, and I thought that would look super cool with this guy. So I gave it a shot, because experimenting with digital art is like, why wouldn't you? You can do anything you want. So I totally dig the dark blades, and then I gave it like a layer effect, outer glow. I went and chose outer glow, and then put a red glow on it to tie in with my red light on the rest of the subject. And now I'm finally dealing with these hands, which like most artists I would suggest anyway, hands aren't my favorite thing. I used to avoid them completely in my young years as an artist, but once you become a professional and people pay you for art, you can't avoid things anymore. So you just have to get in there and learn how to paint everything. Otherwise you're not someone people should be hiring if you're not willing to be a top employee for them. And just because I took the time to learn how to paint hands doesn't mean I enjoy it, really. I still don't really enjoy it. And I wouldn't ever suggest that I'm anywhere close to as good at painting them as I should probably be. Obviously, references are super vital. Like in most things, references are just huge. Like, you just use references. I've heard people say or ask questions about, like, is it okay to use references or something like that, and it's just absurd, the notion that you should just magically know how to paint everything out of your head. Like, definitely build your visual library, but don't condemn yourself to crap artwork because you should have known how everything in the world looks. Like, go find, if you don't know how to paint a hand in a certain pose, go find a picture of a hand or take one of your own hand and use it as a reference. There's no shame in references. In fact, I would go as far as to say it's shameful not to use them on some, for the sake of pride or some false sense of needing to just know stuff in your head. It's really strange to me that that's a thing. Anyway. So just going in and refining a little bit, adding a little bit more interest to my silhouette. Getting a little deeper with some shadows. And I can see that using airbrush to put my light source in kind of left a little bit of the wrong impression on the part catching light on the forehead detail. So somewhere along the way I need to get in there and tighten that up. But for now I'll just stick with the darks. Just refining, making decisions with my shapes, like final decisions with my shapes. Here I wanted to make sure that this chest part feels like it's broken up, like it's turning multiple directions. And so I created one value that looks like it's turning away from the light, one value that looks like it's facing kind of perpendicular to the light, the top one, and then an in-between. It's always good to zoom out frequently when you zoom in to tighten your details, because if you don't, you can absolutely go down a terrible path and work really hard on something just to make it look bad. I don't know how many times especially in my early years as a digital artist, because I had never, in traditional art, which I grew up doing most of my life, you don't get to zoom in. You just work at the zoom of your eyes. And when I started doing digital art, the ability to zoom in and just like tighten up your detail to crazy levels if you want to was, it was really neat, I guess, and I got caught up in those early days, and I would spend a bunch of time zoomed in and then zoom out and realize either nothing changed or I absolutely went down a path of terrible detailing that didn't look good, wasn't right. And then I have to erase it, and yeah, lessons learned the hard way. Here I just want to try and get this left leg of the robot to look like he's taking a step. And so if he took a step forward, then that leg would come into the light, because the light is over my right shoulder and above. So coming out from the shadow of the body and into the light, and then I'll put a little shadow on the left leg to make it look like it's stepping back into. So It's pretty subtle, but what I'm trying to accomplish is that tiny effect of this thing is walking towards you. And right now it feels a little too stark a contrast. I don't want people to look down there, so what I'm going to do is just bring the opacity down. So I'm still kind of getting the effect without making it too high contrast. I don't want people spending the majority of their time looking at this thing's leg. Clearly, I wanted the people to look at its head and chest and kind of those cooler, like, torso details and silhouette. So now, on the same layer that I created my blade on that has an outer glow effect setting on it, I'm just using a hard round brush and creating these energy flecks, kind of like embers burning off of this blade. I thought it would be a cool way to make my background more interesting and also make his weapons interesting and unique. Like, there's something different about them than just your average energy blade. And now I'm using an airbrush on a new layer set to color dodge and trying to get really hot with the red glow. I'm also going through and kind of hitting the eyes and other areas where I put light. Doing a little bit of refining on these little hydraulic tubes, or there's some kind of fluid or something would go through those tubes, something that helps keep it moving. Now I kind of want to push the embers up top back so it looks like they're going into space, like, and they're getting harder to, they're less clear because there's atmosphere around them. That helps sell a little bit more depth in the image. Getting in there and refining some of my brightest lights and using an airbrush to put some bloom. Like I said, there's a backlight, so that bit of bloom really helps make it feel like that light is back behind him. I just lost that edge right there on purpose. Sometimes it's really good to have lost edges. If you look at stuff in reality, there's multiple types of edges. There are blurred edges, there are lost edges, there are hard edges, and that one turning towards the light I thought would probably be pretty much lost in reality, so I went ahead and just erased the edge. Here I'm just experimenting a little bit. I've created another copy of my layer, so if I mess it up I don't have to worry, but I'm just trying to warp it a little bit. Eventually I end up using liquify, and I just push around just a little bit some of the design so that he doesn't look literally perfectly symmetrical, because that doesn't look as organic as I want. So I just kind of pushed one shoulder down, just little tweaks makes it less symmetrical. Widening the canvas a little bit to let the swords breathe on the outsides. They were a little bit too confined. And hitting it with an exposure layer to push my contrast, and I think that's going to wrap this one up. I really enjoyed this painting. It was great fun. The Symmetry mode is an amazing way to get your design ideas down. Like I said, go and experiment with it, have some fun, and just remember that you don't actually have to use your design as the finished piece. You can design with Symmetry mode turned on, take that and use it as a reference to put your characters into all kinds of different poses, and all your design issues are already dealt with before you start posing your character, which is really great. Anyways, I hope you got something out of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you guys in the next one.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and share it with your friends. Make sure you ring that bell for notifications of future videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one.